Okay, well, very welcome to this meeting this evening. A céad míle fáilte to you all to this Zoom talk. This is pretty innovative for Oranmore Heritage, and let's hope that we don't encounter any gremlins tonight. For your added enjoyment, the microphones will be muted during the talk. However, you will have an opportunity at the end to comment or ask questions. The alternative, of course, is to put your comments and your questions in the chat, and we'll get back to you afterwards. Just to let you know that this talk has been the Heritage Group. This talk this evening is based on a talk given in 2013. The talk was delivered then by local historian John Greeley, who was also an expert on the old graveyard. The research carried out and documented is an invaluable resource. What will I do? Will I? The research carried out and documented is an invaluable resource for Oranmore Heritage and for indeed the diaspora researching their family tree. For the purpose of this talk, we will take a brief look at how the restoration project came about and its subsequent findings. Oranmore Old Graveyard is located on the right-hand side as you go towards the southern end of the village of Oranmore. Actually, it's directly to the rear of Centra. It was originally accessed by a lane, clearly shown on the old Ordnance Survey map. The lane has long since disappeared, absorbed into the commercial development, but it is still possible to access the graveyard by getting a key in Cairns, of course, when we return to normal. Oranmore natives have been resting peacefully in this graveyard for many centuries. However, in 2000, in the County Galway Draft Development Plan, it was proposed to convert the graveyard into a pocket park in order to provide public open space in the middle of the village for the people of Oranmore. At that stage, the graveyard had been closed for almost 50 years, even though a few interments did subsequently take place there. It was only thanks to the action of a small group of interested locals, realizing that the final resting place of family, friends, and ancestors was under threat of development, that they got together and formed the Graveyard Restoration Committee. At that time, the graveyard had become totally overgrown and neglected. Indeed, it had become the location for antisocial behavior. The perimeter wall had been breached, resulting in rubbish accumulating, and in essence, this was a wasteland. Fortunately, thanks to this group, the development of the pocket park never materialized. As well as that, the graveyard was designated as an archaeological heritage, as an archaeological site. The first step in the restoration process was to begin the cleanup. The group cut back bushes and brambles. They removed nettles and weeds. The ivy had reached heights of over 10 feet in places, and all of this was cut down and cleared away. They also repaired and secured the perimeter wall. Gradually, the secrets of the graveyard, untouched for half a century, were uncovered. The most significant of those discoveries included the ruins of a medieval church, a vast array of headstones of various sizes and shapes, dating back hundreds of years, and a nun's burial plot. Unlike modern graveyards, where graves are in straight lines with easy access, not only was this graveyard in a regular shape, covering an area of 0.302 hectares, but the graves were randomly positioned with little or no access. One metre wide and about 30 metres from the perimeter wall was laid around the graveyard. The path has many twists and turns to prevent walking on the slabs or the designated graves. However, it proved very effective in sectioning the graveyard for the planned survey. Now, here we have the path. The photo shows on the left the path leading from the entrance gate to the perimeter wall of the Church of Ireland site. It continues round the perimeter wall and right around, and this is it again, approaching the exit, approaching the little small gate. But the path winds its way, twists and turns in through the graveyard, as we will see later on. While all the graves are oriented in an east-west direction, there are no ordered rows, and it was found that the graves are in a chaotic distribution. Dating the site was difficult. All efforts to find documented history relating to the site have yielded little to date. Like many graveyards, where ownership could not be established, it came under the jurisdiction of the Burial Board in the mid-1800s. With the demise of the Burial Board, it became the responsibility of the local authority, in this case, Galway County Council. For the purpose of the next stage of the restoration, that is carrying out of the survey, the site was divided into sections. Oh, there is the path under snow last week. Now we have a map of the survey, which is color coded. The section A here on the left is just inside the entrance gate. It extends to the point where the path meets the wall near the end of the Church of Ireland site, and that's colored in purple. Section B, the dark green area, extends from the northern end of the church ruin to the path and is bounded by the perimeter wall on the northwestern corner. Section C. This includes the nuns' graveyard and the monument within the church ruin. Section D reaches in light green, reaches from the nuns' graveyard here on my right across, includes the nun graveyard at the entrance gate and is bounded by the perimeter wall to the rear of the village. This wall here. Section E is located on the northern side of the path, which forms the boundary to section A, and that's color coded in blue. And section F is in yellow, bound by the other two sections. So we will go now to zone B and visit the ruins of the medieval church. The church is thought to be 13th century. Although only the side walls remain, there is an indication that it was a much larger church. Here we see a view of the side walls. Clearly, being a stonemason was a very sought after trade, since the church is located very close to the Oranmore Castle, another beautiful stone structure. The church windows. We have evidence here of the skilled workmanship of the stonemasons, in the way that the stone has framed the windows and probably framed the doors also. Some of the stones from the church can be found as grave markers throughout the graveyard. It is likely that the church fell into disuse following the Reformation in the period around the 16th century. In the Ordnance Survey letters of 1837, it is described as a ruin. So there are a number of slabs within the precincts dating from as early as 1600s. Here we have a slab. 1661 is very clearly seen, not in this photograph, but it's very clearly seen on the slab. In addition to the slabs dating from the medieval period in the immediate vicinity of the ruin, and this would support the belief that it dates back to that period. So now we move along and take a look at some of the other features of the graveyard. There are grave slabs known as ledgers. There are many types of headstones with carved uppers of various shapes, from elaborate Celtic crosses and small upright stones and graves then with no identity. With the paths laid and the graveyard cleaned up, the group decided to try and record the inscriptions on the headstones. All visible slabs and monuments were recorded in a thorough examination of the site. However, because the site was neglected for so many years, it is also possible that slabs had sunk into the ground, and indeed the growth and dying back of vegetation over many years would also have formed a layer of topsoil. All this work has been documented and into a detailed map of the site, and each grave is identified with a number. While close to 200 graves were identified clearly, possibly thousands were interred here, whose graves were marked only by a simple stone or probably not even marked at all. The types of monuments recorded vary in size and in nature of the inscriptions that they displayed. Monuments identified from the 1700s were typically very small, no more than 60 centimeters in height, and usually showed only the initials of the deceased and the date of their demise. Interestingly, all of the monuments of this period had the inscription IHS, a monogram for the name of Jesus Christ. Here is a close zoomed in slide to clearly indicate the IHS. It's worth remembering that in the 1700s, the penal laws were still on the statute books. Permission was still required to have a funeral, and it was necessary to pay a stipend to the local Anglican clergyman. This may explain the small size of the monuments. There are a number of these slabs throughout the graveyard. Noteworthy is that the script of the inscription on the slab is raised Roman style. This means, this isn't a very clear photo, but it means that the stone was chiseled around the date, and the date stood, and the letters stood proud of the surface of the stone. The majority of the other inscriptions were incised. This is a clear example of that. Some are still clear, however, many more are worn with the passage of time. Only those with clear inscriptions were recorded. From the 1800s, the letter Y replaced the word the, and the word and was also replaced by a curious marking. The practice of the time, when erecting a monument to the deceased, was to name the deceased and add the words "and posterity" at the end. Celtic crosses were also a feature. Many of these were very elaborate, and anecdotally it's believed that they could have been financed by relatives in America. Here on the left, we have a very substantial Celtic cross, and on the right, we have an ornate Celtic cross. For example, it has been recorded that on one of the Celtic crosses in the graveyard, erected by Roger Mahon, America, in loving memory of his parents and his brother James, who died on May the 17th, 1891. Clearly, things would have been difficult enough around the area at the time, so a substantial headstone like that would have been funded from America. Now, artwork is another feature of the graveyard. There are many examples of sunbursts and angels, but here we have a carving of an angel with a trumpet calling the dead to judgment. A Latin inscription, "A mortem et venite ad iudium," is also found in more than one grave. Here we have the beautiful carving of the angel with the trumpet, and very clearly here we have IHS carved, surrounded by beautiful artwork. There are several examples of this type of artwork in the graveyard. Aberrations in spellings were not uncommon, and these appear in the survey as they appeared on the grave slab. This may be due to human error or to the fact that some names had multiple spellings. For example, Fury, F-U-R-Y, or F-U-R-E-Y, or Coen, C-O-E-N and C-O-A-N. Occupational symbols was another feature of the graveyard. Tradesmen were very proud of their talents and had the tools of their trade carved onto their ledgers or the slab stones. Many of the gravestones are decorated with elaborate symbols. An example of this is the final resting place of James Malone, who departed this life on February the 22nd, 1797, aged 67 years. It is safe to assume that he was a blacksmith. Clearly, we have the anvil. On the bottom half of the slab is a panel with an arched top, and it's carved the outline of an anvil, a hammer, and a tongs or a pincers. It is also the grave of it's also on the grave of Matthias Birmingham, who departed this life on January the 30th, 1790, aged 84. His grave slab shows a square panel, this time with a hammer, tongs, or pincers on each side and a horseshoe over the anvil in the middle. On the slab of Hugh Coen are seen the tools of a carpenter: an axe, a saw, a pincers, and a square. We can also spare a thought for those who lovingly placed a stone on the unmarked graves of their loved ones. They could not afford any kind of a stone. This brings us to the nun's grave. The Presentation Sisters' original grave is located on the northeast corner, surrounded by railings. Previously surrounded by a high wall, it has now been incorporated into the main graveyard. The dates of this memorial plaque erected here are a clear indication that the nuns lived during arguably the harshest time in Irish history, the Great Famine and subsequent famines. In view of the impact of the Presentation Sisters had on the education of generations of young girls in Oranmore and the surrounding area, it is worth giving a short background to their story and how they arrived in Oranmore. In 1861, 4 sisters set up a school for girls in the building opposite Amorica restaurant on the main street, a building familiar to you all. This was possible because of a bequest of £2,000 by Galway councillor John Blake, whose lifelong ambition was to found a convent. 2 of his sisters were members of the Presentation Order. By 1874, the number of girls attending the school had risen to 350. Not only did the girls get a good education, but because of the levels of poverty, the nuns provided food and clothes for the girls who were almost destitute. The original founding sisters were buried in the nuns' little cemetery behind their first home. As we know, the Presentation Sisters continued to provide education for girls up to the 1990s. As we see here, this was surrounded by this is the nuns' burial plot. It was surrounded by a high wall, but later incorporated into the main graveyard. The memorial has been placed on the graveyard in order to show the appreciation of the Oranmore community to the sisters for their wonderful contribution. In conjunction, for the wonderful contribution. Here we have the plaque put in place by the community. I haven't a close-up of it, but I can tell you some of the names, they lived right through the famine years. For example, Sister Teresa Donlan, age 73, died in 1873, so she was born in 1800. She had a fairly tough run of her 73 years. And Sister Mary Rose McGee died in 1841, and she was aged 59 years. So she lived right through the famine. It was a difficult time for them. So in conjunction with the survey of the graveyard, the register of deaths for the Ecclesiastical Parish of Oranmore from the year 1864 to 1850 was also examined and recorded. In comparing the survey of the graveyard and the register of deaths, it appears that not all deaths were registered. There were discrepancies in addresses, and this fact was supported by local knowledge. It is widely accepted that 10 to 15% of deaths were not recorded, and research would indicate that the percentage was even much higher in Oranmore. As late as the 1970s, Professor Kennedy, a pathologist in the regional hospital, told the health board that as many as 35% of those buried in parts of the west of Ireland were buried without being registered. The cemetery behind St. Mary's Church, which is now the library, was opened in the 1930s, and that brought to an end, with very few exceptions, the use of this graveyard. So the gates were finally closed around the 1930s. The maintenance of the graveyard. Clearly, this was a big challenge for the group. For almost a decade following the completion of the restoration project, members of the group worked tirelessly, continuing the upkeep of the graveyard. Employees from various work schemes, for example, FOSS and THUS, became involved during the second decade and did a great job. However, this scheme has now been discontinued. Once again, this valuable archaeological and heritage site is in danger of becoming a wilderness once more, unless some form of maintenance can be found and put in place. This would be a huge loss to the Oranmore community. Perhaps there are younger members out there who might like to take an interest in this project in order to ensure its preservation for future generations. And as I said at the beginning, this is just a very brief overview of the old graveyard. And so much has been, and so much remains still to be done. In this project, there were a great number of people involved. However, I'm sure no one will mind if I single out the original graveyard committee. John Greeley, Kathleen Cannon, Eilish Mulroy, Kieran Fury, the late Kathleen Davis, Martin Burns, Alice Scanlon, Bill Scanlon, Nicky O'Malley, Marty O'Malley, and Willie Joe Burke. This community is very indebted to you. And on a final note, across the wall from the graveyard is the Church of Ireland graveyard, now an overgrown wilderness. I have it on good advice that there's a grave there, and the person's name has a connection with Captain Fletcher of the famous Mutiny on the Bounty. Now, there's a challenge for someone to go in and find that grave. Goramila Mahagi, thank you.